Shalom. Welcome back to Window on Mount Zion. Today we are reading chapter 3 and part 2. The borders had been quiet and life returned to normal. Early one morning, hearing singing voices and beating drums, I looked out of my window to see a procession which was coming through the small gate from the direction of David's tomb and making its way to the shade of a very old mulberry tree nearby. There, about 40 men, women, and children had gathered. The scene became one of tremendous activity. Some were busy spreading mats on which to sit, others were lighting small fires for cooking, while seemingly endless numbers of food containers were being unpacked. Excited voices were conversing, instructing, laughing. I went down to inquire what it was all about. They were the members of one family from Iraq. Many were dressed in Oriental clothing. I learned that the eldest son of the family had been seriously ill. His wife told me, "We took him to many doctors. They all said he could never get better and would not live long." His old parents were standing near her and listening closely. "But we did not believe the doctors," said the old father, his wrinkled face under his turban-style headgear smiling with satisfaction. "We came here to ask King David to help us. The Almighty is greater than all the doctors." The mother nodded her agreement, lifting her hands and eyes heavenwards. "Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem, blessed be his name. Baruch Hashem," she repeated several times. "We came to Mount Zion every day to pray," said the man's wife. "We knew that King David would help us with our prayers and that the Almighty would cure my husband." Their faith had been acknowledged and the sick man had recovered completely. For this miracle of healing, the whole family had now come together to Mount Zion to give thanks. They prayed near David's tomb all the morning, and now, with the relative who'd been restored to health in their midst, they were celebrating with great rejoicing. The young women were dancing some Eastern dances to the accompaniment of drum and song, and the children were doing their share in adding to the noise. The singing and the rhythmic beating of the drums continued until the close of day, and as the muezzin finished calling the Muslims to prayer at sunset, silence again came to Mount Zion. During the time that we'd been living on Mount Zion, a small group of our friends in Jerusalem had grown to form the nucleus of a brotherhood of goodwill. We came together one evening every month to exchange thoughts and aspirations. We all shared the longing to see the fulfillment of the promise for peace on earth, and to participate as far as in our power in praying for and building up this life of peace. Together we sought to learn from the Bible by study and contemplation, and to put what we had learned into practice in our daily lives. While friends from England and Germany were staying with us, sharing the same vision and drawn to us by the same spirit, we arranged an evening for all to meet together. It was a very representative gathering. We ranged in age from under 20 to over 80, and were drawn from many different circles of thought and belief. There were Jews, pious and orthodox, liberal and conservative, Christians, free and bound, a Jew who'd become a Catholic priest, and a Christian who'd become a Jew. And there was also a Jew who, while believing in the messiahship of Jesus, remained a devout Jew, united with his people, and was not connected with any church or Christian community. Almost every part of the spiritual road was represented, but each one believed in the one God, and was filled with the Spirit of love and goodwill, which united us all and made us one family, the children of God. Among us were poets, musicians, teachers, business and professional men, housewives, priests, and students. 5 different languages were spoken, including Esperanto. Background, character, temperament, and nationality were all so varied that it seemed impossible for such a mixed assembly to find any means of communication or unity. The Esperantist, who was always advocating the importance of Esperanto, declared that evening, "Well, here you have an example of the need for a common language. How can you possibly get to know one another without it?" Sitting next to him were 2 women, one a poet who knew no German, the other a simple housewife from Germany who knew no other language. Smiling and happy, their eyes shining, they had found some way of communicating. They understood each other. Girl students from England soon made contact with Israeli students through music, song, and dance. A poetess read her poems in Hebrew. Someone who did not understand the language very well said to me, "Although I did not understand all the words, I seemed to understand the spirit, and that gave me much pleasure." The priest turned to the musician at his side, saying, "How is it possible that such a mixed group of people, some meeting for the first time, can be so united, happy, and completely at ease?" The pious Jew on the other side of him, hearing the remark, answered, "The Spirit of Zion has descended upon us and made us one." Then he turned to the Esperantist. "The language of the heart is far more eloquent than the spoken word." And the Esperantist had to admit that the language barrier had not marred the joy or the unity of spirit at the gathering. The over 80 and the under 20s all joined hands in dance and song. The pious Jew seemed to have an added joy within him. He seemed to be looking into the future. "What we see and feel here tonight," he said, "will one day be experienced by all the world. The day when the Lord promised, 'I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh.'" Next on Mount Zion came the festival of Shavuot, or Pentecost. The 7 weeks since the second day of Pesach had passed. It was the eve of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, known to the Christians as Pentecost. Once again, pilgrims from all corners of the land were climbing the steps to Mount Zion to celebrate in the vicinity of David's tomb, as near as possible to the site where the Holy Temple had once stood, the sanctuary that housed the Ark of the Covenant with the original stone tablets of God's Word, inscribed by the finger or spirit of God himself. The pilgrims began arriving with their wives and children after midday. The bundles they carried on their shoulders included blankets and sleeping bags, and in their hands were buckets and baskets packed with food and drinks. They had come to spend a night, or perhaps 2, on Mount Zion. The second night of Shavuot is traditionally recognized as the anniversary of David's death, and is spent reading the Psalms of David. For 24 hours, the candle lit in his memory flickers above the heads of the worshippers. Before the sun had set, I walked through the buildings in which the tomb of David is housed. I had to be very careful when I stepped where I stepped, for in the dimly lit vaulted chambers, blanket-covered human forms were lying in all the corners and alcoves on the stone floors. Some slept from exhaustion after their long journey. Others were making sure of their place for the night. Children ran about while mothers were unpacking their food and utensils. A long wooden table was being erected close to the tomb. Here the men would sit all night, reading and praying. Later, when the sun had gone and darkness hid us from the vigilance of the enemy, we again entered the dimly lit chambers of the old stone buildings. Within a few hours, The usual cold emptiness of these dark arched rooms had been transformed into the warmth and intimacy of a home. Families sat around in circles on mats on the floors. Plates were being filled with food, and there were cups for fruit drinks or wine. Some were singing folk songs in the language of the country from which each had come. The children were singing the songs of Israel in Hebrew. An aged man, the lines on his face engraved by time and the sun, sat holding a small child on his knee. With welcoming eyes and a toothless smile, he beckoned me to sit beside him. His daughter, a woman well on in years, offered me a plate of some spiced exotic food. "Come," she said, "share in our happiness." As I sat down beside the old man, his son told me in a mixture of French and Hebrew. "We came from Morocco 10 years ago. Every year on Shavuot we come here to thank the Almighty for bringing us to our promised land." In the family circle was a girl who looked no more than 16, and she was suckling a baby at her breast. The child was the old man's great-great-grandson. The generations had come together for this pilgrimage from a distant village in the Negev. "We like to spend Shavuot with King David," one of the sons said. They all spoke of David as though he were physically present with them, and he had invited them to Mount Zion for this festival. I walked among the other happy families squatting on the floor. Whatever their problems in Israel, they had been forgotten for this special occasion. All through the night, the faint chanting of prayers could be heard, and mingled with the intermittent cries of children, the barking of dogs, and the voices of people moving about in the darkness. I was conscious of the listening ears of the nearby Jordanian soldiers on guard duty, and recognized the footsteps of our own soldiers on patrol. The brightness of the stars waned as the first rosy flush of dawn suffused the eastern horizon, heralding sunrise and the approach of another day. The singing of the Hasidim on the roof of King David's tomb marked the joyous end of the night of prayers. The sleepers were awakening, and children were stirring with excitement in their unaccustomed surroundings. People from the city were arriving to join the worshippers. Soon the synagogues were filled, and all around people were mingling and jostling together. Among them were also the tourists and sightseers, the onlookers who stood on the fringes of the joyous experience of those who were all the guests of King David.